So I think one of the things that came up in both of your presentations, I think around this question of cultural preservation is also this issue of gentrification. So I want to start by, I'm going to kind of go in a bit of a circle and touch on a couple of different things from your presentations and kind of come back. I think there's this kind of question of whose culture and also the ways in which charters for heritage preservation and then leading to cultural districts now, but also just even like the UN Charter and Declaration of Human Rights, like how these came to be and who was and wasn't included in these initially. Whenever I think about the UN Charter, the Declaration for Human Rights, I always associate that in a timeline. Well, it's a post Second World War. I think that it came out of as a result of that. It had huge implications for my community here because 1947 was the first year that the Chinese Exclusion Act was finally repealed. So that was 6 decades, 62 years of no immigration. And that was kind of in response to this UN charter. But at the same time, this is also around when the charter for the Refugee Convention also comes out in 1951 from the UN. And at that time, the refugees were very, very specifically defined as this charter only gave you freedoms if you were a refugee due to events occurring in Europe before January 1st, 1951. And that's actually still the thing that we use. We just made a little amendment in 1967 that expanded that beyond that geographical and time location. And so we think about the basic rights for immigration, for seeking asylum, and the Charter of Human Rights, the Declaration for Human Rights, also has the right for housing, but it's actually that history of it till very recently is extremely Eurocentric. And so I think that has a lot of implications on how we build today. And I think the famous example that's kind of it's come up a lot in the process of the City of Toronto's movement towards the Cultural Districts program is that in 2015, the City of Toronto approved a grant for $10,000 worth of funding for window repairs for houses designated with heritage designation in Rosedale. And so if you wanted to like upgrade your window in Rosedale, which is a prominent white neighborhood, you had access to funding to do that. Meanwhile, in Little Jamaica, I'm certain that there was not this funding available to actually help or support any businesses that actually would represent, critical or important heritage that is actually supporting and building the community. So in this question of thinking about how there is a long legacy of heritage and culture being preserved only for a small group of people. And as we try to use, I think we often use heritage practices to try to it's like almost like a last resort thing that we can try to fight off something. We can kind of use this. It's often being mobilized this way by communities, but we're still using these tools that have these legacies and the potential to actually do harm in the opposite way that we're intending. So just kind of wanting to throw that over to both of you and see how, I'm sure you've encountered this in your work many, many times, and how you have been navigating that, and also to, our audience of our next generation of designers, architects, planners, city makers, how they can kind of sort of think and work through some of these questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I also really appreciate that, sharing that history around the Chinese Exclusion Act. Yeah, so human rights is really interesting, right? It is objective. The only issue is that it is not something that is protected from our very subjective world, right? So it comes down to who has the power over deciding whether or not who has power. I think it can just even summarize it as in that way, right? So one way to access power is capital and is money. One way to access power is ownership of property. Another way to access power is position in government. And so looking into Little Jamaica, for example, a lot of the Black businesses, they don't necessarily own their property. And so this results in a multitude of issues. For example, in 2020, when there was a huge campaign led by the Black community to have financing to Black businesses to support their operation, the city and other levels of government provided grants to offset the cost of property taxes. Who received the benefit? The property owners, right? And did they pass on those benefits back to the businesses? No. And then, you know, there's all this money being put into returning, bring back Main Street. And it's about cultural programming and all that stuff. But you know what? If they're not able to actually have ownership over their spaces, once that Main Street is revitalized and it's popping and everyone's trying to walk down that street and go grab a patty, you know, will there actually be patties to grab? Who's going to be owning that patty store? That culture, the authentic culture from the people itself won't be supported. So in Black Futures on Eglinton, that project was funded by the Ministry of Heritage, and it was specific to supporting Black communities protect their culture. And so in Black Futures on Eglinton, we touched upon a variety of topics from housing to performance art, and access to housing is actually a really important way to protect our culture because that is your safe space. But you know, the funding to be able to directly invest in these types of solutions, to direct, for example, in ownership of our businesses and business spaces, you know, I think is really important to always to speak to people who are elders to you because they can tell you the story of what's been happening and how the system has played the game. And so in the Black community, oftentimes when we are provided with funding of any kind, it's towards culture, arts and performance, never towards infrastructure and ownership of infrastructure, which is incredibly disheartening because, you know, at one time we were considered as infrastructure and free labor. And so now we're not allowed to then receive that support to develop our own infrastructure and to, you know, have reparations for that, for those and the barriers that are caused, right? In Little Jamaica, actually, you know, there was a campaign that was launched by the community to support for the Black businesses to get some funding. And now, because we don't have ownership over those systems that are there, and the people who have ownership are the business owners who are predominantly white in the neighborhood, now they're the ones who are going to have control over how that money is spent. So all of the millions, the hundreds of thousands of dollars towards the millions that has been put into Little Jamaica, there's been no transfer of property. And so that culture can only be sustained so long when you're in a system where you are, you know, requesting and at the whims of those who actually have the power, which is in this country, those who have property and those who have, you know, are in the political class. And sadly enough, you know, we're not quite there yet in terms of having those resources.
Do it. One.
There.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, Cheryl said a lot. I'll go back to, I think, what you were talking about with, yeah, sorry, what you were talking about with heritage. And it's an interesting question that we're, as architects and thinking about architecture, trying to wrap our heads around. I was speaking about, you know, what is modernist heritage in a lot, you know, I think, speaking of Toronto, but, you know, similar with Southwestern Ontario, there's an idea that Victorian architecture is heritage, and that's been accepted as heritage. And it's really about, you know, built form and architectural details and architectural and tectonics that form the heritage. And then there's, you know, questions of heritage beyond that, of, you know, cultural heritage or what happens in a place. And I think, you know, I've been challenged by people that are saying, what's like the architectural heritage in Little Jamaica? And I think it's a good question because you could sort of ask, I think you could say that in so many neighborhoods. You know, I think you could say that in Kensington Market, for example, where, you know, you look at the buildings, or you look at buildings on Queen West, which is, you know, a cultural district in the city, or many core neighborhoods in Toronto. And you look at the buildings and there's not particularly anything beautiful about them. And in a lot of ways, I find Toronto a very ugly city from just an architectural perspective, but you know, it's questioning heritage beyond, say, just, you know, a physical architectural detail, but you know, what sort of a lived experience or a history is one thing I think looking at. And I think an unfortunate thing is sometimes heritage is the only option. I think ultimately, like Little Jamaica wasn't, or you can sort of say Chinatown or Yorkville or Kensington Market, sort of these neighborhoods that we love that have value, Little India, Little Italy, they weren't created by a top-down approach. And I think from a planning architectural perspective, what's unfortunate is we don't allow new Little Jamaicas to occur or new Kensington Markets to occur from, you know, what Cheryl was talking about with zoning. And I think, and it's not even to say that I think neighborhoods can't change, it's who has the autonomy in how they change. There's, you know, and cities change. And I think that's a question. I think that's a kind of a core to the change in Little Jamaica, is that it's not driven by, say, community upward mobility of, you know, I think an example, again, referring to Kensington Market, where Jews in Kensington Market, it was a market and they gradually moved up Bathurst Street to Forest Hill, where it was, you know, their own making in a lot of terms versus, you know, transit and Jews gentrification. I think that's different.
Yeah,
Say in neighborhood chain, I think that's kind of where what you're talking about with ownership. If you don't own a building, you're at the whims of, you know, the landlord. You're at the whims of, you know, changing, speculative, rising property.
I think in many ways also, even with ownership, you're often also at the whim of the city. I think in many ways, the part of my intro prompt that I forgot to mention is 1947. That was the year that the Chinese Exclusion Act was finally repealed, but that was also the year that City Council voted to expropriate old Chinatown, bulldoze at least 2/3 of it. There was, you know, some rallying in the Save the Chinatown campaign that maybe sort of saved the last 1/3, which is not really there anymore today anyway. But they decided to expropriate it to build new City Hall. It was like the same year. It was also the year that Chinese Canadians got the right to vote federally for the first time. So it was like all of these things kind of happening layered. And so even, I mean, most folks did not own, but even folks who did, like, you're kind of out of luck as well. There are a couple of things that
example in not having autonomy in a community, like a bulldozing a community is like a picture perfect example of not having a say in changing your community.
Also, I don't know, one thing that I like find shocking just in terms of the way that immigrants are treated in this country. And I think it's also maybe to note, right, the predominant immigrant today is a person of color. So maybe that has something to do with it. If we were predominantly a country welcoming new white immigrants, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. But you could be living in this country for 10 years on a PR, wanting to get citizenship and not get your citizenship. I just find astounding, because then you are paying taxes, you're committed to living here, you can't vote. You can't vote municipally, you can't vote provincially, you can't vote federally. So there's, you know, the stats around the demographics of this country. So many people are not actually given a voice to participate in these processes, to have their voices reflected in the way that, you know, our you know, government is organized and operated.
I'm trying to organize which points to talk on, because there's so many that I want to get to, and I know we have a time limit still. There are two things that you both mentioned so far. One thing that I love that you described, Cheryl, was that the protection of housing is the protection of culture. I think, yes, 100%. I love that. But that is so not what is happening right now. Affordable housing is not, I think, what people typically think about in terms of like cultural preservation or like a policy for a cultural district. I think when people talk about it generally, it's not what comes to mind. I think the Victorian architecture is what people think about when they think about protecting housing, not the right to housing. I think, okay, so that's part one. Part two is around how do we understand architectural heritage in Little Jamaica or in Chinatown and cultural districts. I'm gonna like split those in half now. We'll go back to, we'll come back to the second half. And one of the things that I wanted to focus on actually is this question of housing and affordable housing and this issue of density, which is also then tied back into gentrification, which we're trying to use cultural preservation or heritage to work towards anti-displacement, but I think often in this model of density and gentrification, those are kind of all being worked on together. So I'm curious to hear what both of your thoughts are actually on the most recent cultural districts programming proposal from J Picture Placemaking, specifically around this question of like housing density, gentrification, and how those all kind of tie in to this notion. So of course there had to be like, you knew I was going to ask specifically about cultural districts. This one was coming. But yeah.
There's, I think, a lot of things that you mentioned. I think one thing regarding density, and I think, you know, we were talking about that in Little Jamaica. Cheryl was talking about, you know, many neighborhoods in the city of Toronto are actually having a loss of people, loss of populations. They're de-densifying, you want to call it that. And, you know, the fact of that neighborhoods, your example about, you know, building a bungalow, that you could pop that up to a 2 or 3 story single family home, but you're not necessarily changing density, the number of people. It's still a single family home. And where we allow for density in the city is quite limited. So in Little Jamaica is mentioning, it's, you know, a strip along Eglinton West. You know, then the challenge then being, if that's the kind of the retail and cultural heart of the street, and that's the only place where you're allowing for change, you can inevitably see the kind of confrontation that of the outcome of that. So I think our approach to density in the city of Toronto, and even our Alexandra Park, you know, question was kind of challenging that, like that, you know, you can have, you know, a point tower next to a low rise, or not. It doesn't have to be this sort of continuous, cohesive, you know, mid-rise city. And, you know, questioning, and I think, you know, what you're doing with partners, like kind of expanding ideas, or doing with Venice Biennale, expanding ideas on beyond just laneway housing, and seeing the challenges and the limits of an accessory dwelling unit isn't enough, and it's not actually even that many people. I think with the cultural districts, I know that's still an ongoing thing, and Jay's going to be releasing that. I will say, and I think before, cultural districts to a certain degree, or unfortunately to a certain degree, so much of our work is reactionary, and it's like I admire like what Cheryl's doing so much, because it's, you know, you're creating your own projects, and as an architect, even as a proactive architect, you're proactively trying to seek out clients, as opposed to, you know, I would love it if we lived in a world where, like, you know, the government funded affordable housing, and, you know, the focus could just be on making beautiful housing, and the affordability just wasn't even a question. It was just acknowledged as a thing. So, and I think it's amazing to see what you're doing. And I think back to the cultural district, in a way, it's reactionary. Like, it's great that these things are happening, but it's also, again, I get to the point of communities, you know, happened, Little Jamaica, and there's multiple kind of Jamaican communities. Like, there were older ones, you know, Bathurst and Bloor. There's been Black communities in Canada for, you know, in Toronto for hundreds of years. And it's, you know, communities didn't happen by, you know, sort of down kind of this is a district for this to happen. So there's challenges of that, but it's also, I think the work that you're doing, the work that Buddha's doing is enabling a more grassroots. It's kind of enabling people in their own communities to have the power to kind of establish themselves and to kind of build, to start businesses. The challenges with the city so expensive is, where does that happen? And, as an architect, you realize that the limits of the profession. And so many of the things these are actually planning things that go outside of architecture. Let's touch on things like zoning and zoning bylaws. And what I always see as a challenge is so much of the cities that we love. So it's, whether if it's, a small walk up with a single egress stair that defines, Bloor Street, Queen Street, College Street, you can't build that typology today from both zoning and code perspectives. Or, you can't have a corner store in a residential neighborhood that could, say, support someone operating a business that might be, say, taking time off while they're raising kids. So our zoning bylaws, at least from that perspective, this perspective that I can speak to, kind of really limits what we can do. And I think then compounded with the affordability crisis, just makes it so hard to build and sort of create the culture that happens. And I'm thinking of it's that project It's Okay Stews. They become more established with the city, but they didn't start by someone saying. And again, I think that's great what you're doing. These things don't start. You've created an opportunity for yourself, which is amazing. The guys running It's Okay. They saw an opportunity of creating spaces, throwing events for people in the arts, musicians, artists, hosting events at talks like this, but they didn't ask for permission. And I think that's the challenge. And and again, I think that goes back to zoning. Kensington Market didn't happen because zoning bylaws said we want to make this kind of bohemian cultural food market. Or, Yorkville didn't happen, or Baldwin Village didn't happen. All these sort of great neighborhoods that you can't create today.
I'd love to acknowledge the work that you're doing, Tura. SOCA is incredibly respected, and I'm really impressed with the work that you're doing, the yellow porch and the Pereira, right? When I went to McMichael's a couple of months, I think a month ago, and you knew about them before they were cool. Oh yeah, they're blowing up. Yeah. So, in your work, you're acknowledging the value of having our own spaces, right? So having an architecture firm in the Black community will pay dividends in the future. So in terms of heritage and who is able to have their spaces acknowledged as heritage, in most cases, maybe 95%, 98%, heritage is a monument to the wealthy, right? It's a matter of time before Galen Weston's house gets a heritage plaque on it, if it does not already. And so that's the reason why a lot of spaces that were home to Black communities and Black movements are not protected, because as a community, we're not in the position where we can fight and advocate and be respected for those calls for that cultural and heritage preservation. So I went to Nova Scotia in maybe, I'll just say the summer of last year. They're having a conference, Canadian National Conference, and it was really eye-opening to see Africville. As a Torontonian, as a person born in the mid-90s, I didn't believe racism was real for most of my life, right? My dad would tell me, racism is bad, it will affect you. And I'm like, it's not bad, it's not real. I watched YTV, it's not going to be an issue. Sorry, anyone remember YTV? Okay. Where they're Canada's great and we're all inclusive, right? So I didn't believe racism was real, but During those same times, the federal government was destroying Black neighborhoods. So seeing how Africville, for folks who maybe don't know, was a neighborhood that was generated by Africans who came to Nova Scotia because they were loyalists in the States who helped to fight against the Britons, and then they moved to Nova Scotia. Or there were also some Maroons, some Jamaican Maroons. Some Maroons were a warrior class of people in Jamaica who fought against the colonizers and the slave owners, and they were then transported to Nova Scotia in an attempt to prevent overthrowing that regime. They decided to just move them into Nova Scotia. And so there was a neighborhood that was established in Nova Scotia in the early 1900s. They had school, they had a whole economy, and they made many calls to the government for support. They wrote letters asking for a well to be built, right? Other white settlers were getting funding to establish a well, and then the Black community was not provided that support. Instead, they would have dumps built next to their houses. Their folks were getting sick. There were actually a case where a white truck driver drove into the neighborhood and gave the Black residents a drink that he said, oh, this drink is going to be really great. It's really fun. So, the folks decided to trust this person, and it turned out that it was poison. And so the folks who drank the drink died, and the person who gave the drink was not actually held accountable for this crime. And so, the federal government then supported for the city of Nova Scotia, city of Halifax, to bulldoze Africville completely. They, as folks who have been living there for hundreds of years, you'd imagine that they would have some right to land, but they were never afforded that right. So they were never officially in our property system considered as the owners. And so for many years, they were coerced into selling their property or selling their access to that property. Some folks gave up that access to property. Many did not. There was one man who really held his ground and said, "You're not moving me. I'm going to stay here." And so he stood in his house. And so there was a boulder that was placed, quite acutely placed so that it would fall down and destroy his house. And he was warned, "You better leave before this boulder destroys you and your house." So then he eventually moved out of that house. They destroyed their church in the middle of the night. They came with a truck to demolish the church. Definitely, this should have been heritage protected. It's incredibly culturally significant, but again, that comes down to this idea of ownership and also who is valued, right? These folks were poor. They were poor because the system made them poor. And so what happened is they were then, had their communities destroyed. Now it's a big park. Just want to give a moment to just reflect, if folks can just reflect on what that could be like. You lived in a community, there's generations of your family who's lived in this community, and then the state government just bulldozes it, and now it's a park. So when I was there in Halifax, they still have a cultural practice of coming to that neighborhood and having, so every year, the folks who used to live in that neighborhood come there and they sit on what used to be their lawn and they have a barbecue. And it just really opened my eyes in terms of what is considered heritage. So the state then, after destroying their neighborhood, placed them in public housing that is now, affordable rental housing that is just terrible condition, falling apart by a freeway. There's no way to have that same culture where they used to be able to ask their neighbor for support or have local daycare supported by them, be able to play in their front yard. There's no front yard. It's a freeway, right? So this idea of heritage, it's not everybody who gets to decide, and a lot of it does come down to wealth. So when it comes to the work that city planning does, we really do support for developing cultures of care. So all the community groups that we work with, they are deeply invested in the well-being of their fellow community member and their neighborhood. And so they practice this care through a variety of means. So they're not just investing their time to advocate for support affordable housing, they're also doing other cultural programming. They really care about their neighborhood, they care about their people. And I think that's the type of culture that I would love to see more of, you know, and planning is just one part of it, right? We engage to shape our neighborhoods, but we also do it to shape our relationships to our neighbors, and also then I think to ourselves, right? Like the idea that you live in your neighborhood and you don't say hi to your neighbors, and this is just who I am, right? Is this really who you are, or is it that our culture has directed you to be in this way?
Okay, so I'm going to close us on a little story about Chinatown tied into this question of architectural heritage and responding to the story that you just shared as well. And I did have another question, but I think I probably can't ask it. So, oh, okay. Okay, so I'll share this story and then I'll save my question. I'll hand it over to the audience first. So I think the interesting thing about Chinatown is that it was almost kind of designated it was like anti-designated. Like basically like Chinese people were not allowed to live anywhere else. So you were like Chinatowns emerged because they like you literally weren't allowed to live in any other neighborhood. You could only live here, and that's kind of how they began in North America. And then, interestingly, they started to establish roots, and often they were in places that became downtown and central because the sort of like first wave of immigration for the railway was so early on that they were kind of then became desirable neighborhoods. So there was always then already beginning in the early 1900s a movement to kind of like sort of want to take that land. And the Chinese Exclusion Acts in various forms in Canada, in the US, already started in the mid 1880s and went all the way through the late 1940s. So in this time, there was a population decline, and so maybe like more of less of an ability for the community to mobilize. But interestingly, they chose to mobilize through their architecture. So famously, like San Francisco Chinatown, which is a story that some of you might already know, after the earthquake in 1906. Daniel Burnham, white planner, had already proposed a City Beautiful movement plan for San Francisco 1 year earlier. And he was like, great, perfect time to bulldoze Chinatown and like build this. Of course, other neighborhoods after the earthquake, there was fires. Other neighborhoods had the fires put out. Chinatown was left to burn, of course. And so the way that Chinatown in San Francisco actually still exists is because the Chinese community came together there. At the time, the Chinatown community was actually just a Chinese community. Now it's a Pan-Asian community. But at the time that Chinese community, they hired a team of white architects to redesign Chinatown because they realized that if Chinatown was going to be able to stay, they had to make a culture that mainstream society would like. That would be like their way to not be displaced. And there's a question right now today, which is, can a cultural district designation for Chinatown today, because Chinatown has not decided yet if it will go up for a cultural district designation, like if that will help save Chinatown. And I think it's kind of tied into the same fight of like, they had to do this over a century ago because it was the only way to kind of ensure that they'll stay. And Bernard Maidbeck led this redesign, and the whole team had never been to China before. At that time, there weren't a lot of photographs either, so they were like looking at random. It was basically just like, let me envision a sort of like cultural adventurism of what I might like to have in an exotic, very problematic, and very racist way. That has actually become the architectural heritage of Chinatown today, as we know and love them. And so today, in like the 1980 city plan for Toronto, like in the amendment, they made provisions for a part of Chinatown on Dundas Street to be an area of special identity. And they wrote in there that they're going to encourage the emerging Chinese motif. And then they define it as urban street signs and furniture and architectural detail, because like they actually have no idea what it is. But like that motif was the thing that the community in San Francisco felt backed into a corner that they had to use as their only way to stay here. And it was extremely sort of like racialized process. And so like that's kind of what we're left with as architectural heritage. And at the same time, it's interesting because I think there's a lot of folks who would say that they grew up here, their parents maybe grew up here, maybe their whole family's never been to China before, but they learned to be Asian from Chinatown. And so then they're learning their culture from this culture that's like tied into all of these other kind of, so I think this kind of continued issue of like who has power is tied into this, and like who's culture for. Culture can be used strategically, but then it's still within these layered systems of power. And so the kind of place I was wanting to bring the conversation to now is kind of this question of like, how do you build community power? How do you move up towards citizen control? How do you move up Arnstein's ladder? But also that takes a lot of capacity building. It requires, like you mentioned, all of the volunteer work that went into that Budo's doing or started out doing before funding was found. Even just when you're mentioning like you have like just paying people for their time. So if you're doing community consultations or hopefully doing co-design or co-production, like people should be paid a living wage for all of the knowledge that they're bringing into these projects. That is expert knowledge. But that requires a certain capacity of either time or labor or funding that isn't even there now. And so like, how do we sustain that long term? How do we kind of build that out? I was trying not to ask a question, I asked a question.
Yeah, no, I think I can maybe just provide like a statement that's like to support the closing. I'd say that this is something that I'm myself still figuring out. Just yeah, that's the conclusion.
Yeah, but I mean, even just the capacity to like suddenly expand to a team of 10 and be able to support that, because then it's like, even when funding comes in, what are the sustainable practices to be able to like do that? And then when's the next round? Yeah.
I'll just add, because you're talking about Chinatown being defined by like non-Chinese architects or white architects. I think just, and then let's talk on Dundas. I think I'll close this. We've actually been looking at a lot of the spaces on Little Jamaica, and in these cultural communities aren't designed by architects. So it's a restaurant created by a family, or it's a barber shop, but they are unique spaces and spaces that are designed and just designed by non-professionals. And we've actually been learning a lot, and also through photography. I always find I learn a lot, and I think that informs my design process is through archival photography of space.
I like already want to comment so many things, but I'm gonna finally stop talking and make space for the audience. So any questions from the audience?
I guess the question that I have is kind of a two-part. So the first part is myself as an immigrant to Canada. At first, I came to Canada around 5-6 years ago. Sometimes that I question is, what's the point of building these like cultural community in Canada? Because I know Canada is very like, it's an immigrant country with a lot of different culture. But for example, I'm from Hong Kong, and then a lot of the heritage value and the culture is fading away there, and there's no way for the people to protect them there. So it's kind of the situation that it's getting destroyed, but they can't restore it there because it's not a democratic government. And then these people are becoming like refugees and go into other countries, and they're desperately trying to restore their heritage in other countries. But what does it mean for those countries? Like, I understand that Canada will embrace that type of like they welcome these type of immigrants. But then what does it mean for the people who live here? And maybe it will also be interesting to hear about other countries, like how should the immigrant see themselves rebuilding these cultural community in other countries. And then another thing is that for the people who is in a situation like the Nova Scotia people, that their a heritage value is getting taken away, what can they do at the moment? Because, for example, as architecture student, like I can't just pull up $10 million and then rebuild the whole district myself. So there's very little things that I can do. So sometimes there's this type of powerlessness, but I guess it's quite a broad question, but it's the context is there.
Yeah. So I guess, like, leaving your home country, because I was born here, so my experience of my culture is based off of the Canadian version of Jamaican culture, and then also just Canadian culture. And so Article 29 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights states that through care is how we're able to support, and community is how we're able to achieve our highest self. That's not the exact quote, but that's a version of the meaning. And so to me, what that means and what I've seen and experienced is, we're a nation and community of diversity. And so it takes practice to engage in your culture. So, going back to my own roots as a Jamaican, and through our programming in school and through culture, you're not really encouraged to celebrate your culture, right? Like, your culture will be like a very small part of who you are, but then the majority of how you should act should be Canadian. And I'm really starting to move into the fact that I should really, maintain my connection to my culture and to my heritage. And so in part, actually, Black Beaches on Eglinton was a really great way to start moving into that space. And so, for example, I went to a Chinese New Year party, our house gathering a couple of weeks ago, and, learned how to play mahjong. And so that person who invited me to that party, they are putting into practice their culture and not just deciding to only celebrate Christmas and Thanksgiving, but also celebrating their own Chinese culture, and then also inviting people of non-Chinese heritage as well to participate. Right? If anything, Canada's culture is a fusion, right? So being able to invite other people to enjoy what you have to share, and then just having that commitment and sharing that beauty. And so to the second part of your question, what can be done? I think that's why it's so important to gather in groups and to work together. There are a number of really great architect associations that focus on the role of architects and the leverage that you have as in terms of your role in city building. So there's the Toronto Society of Architects. There's also another architect architect organization. You can talk to me about it afterwards. Do you guys remember? No. Yeah, Toronto Architecture Lab. They're on a hiatus, but it was because a lot of the folks there, recently had babies and they're burning out. But capacity building, right? But the point is that they still got together and they did accomplish a lot during their time of being in action. And then also, towards the Nova Scotia group, they have been gathering for themselves and pushing for reparations and for support for funding to actually have ownership of property. So things cannot be done alone. It's to be done together.
Yeah. After the next question.
Hi. So I think something I've struggled with during architecture, this degree, I guess, is that so we're constantly being told that architecture is not things related to Chinatown or the Black community. The architecture that exists there is not necessarily authentic. But then there's kind of the question of then what is authentic? Because in Chinatown that exists in the Western world or in Black communities, it's I'm just going to use Chinatown because that's what I'm most familiar with. But it's it's Western culture with Chinese flair. But then when I go to China and look at the architecture there, it's Chinese culture with Western flair. So then it's well, they're both inauthentic. So then I struggle with what is actually authentic, that no one really is clarifying that, and it's very hard to put the theory and the knowledge that it's not authentic to actual practice.
I can respond maybe a little bit first, just related to Chinatown, and then pass over. So I think Chinatown is totally authentic in its inauthenticity. right? Like it's like we could get into a whole philosophical debate at this point around the existence of truth and authenticity to begin with. But I think how I understand Chinatown is that Chinatown is an act of resistance. And in doing so, Chinatown continually expands what we understand to be belonging, what we understand to be Canadian, what we understand who gets access to civic participation. And although there are a lot of kind of systemic racism that went into what has created its architecture today, I still love its inauthentic, racist, overly ornamental architecture because that was done in resistance. And it is actually also very beautiful for that. And so Chinatown is authentically not Canadian or Chinese. It is Chinatown, right? It's like fully own other thing. And I think architecture education does subconsciously have a tendency in what we've inherited and how the pedagogy has been taught, which I believe at the school we are working towards undoing a lot of that, but there's a lot of subconscious feeding to you that is like Chinatown is on architecture, but like I think Chinatown definitely is architecture, and there's so much more we can learn. And the fact that it hasn't been considered architecture, we haven't been talking about it enough, is why there isn't more community power in a lot of the spaces and how we build. And the fact that you're thinking about it, which like I think even in my generation, which I'm not that much older than you, like I don't even think many of my classmates were thinking about these questions that you're all thinking about now. Like I think the time is really changing. So at least in terms of Chinatown, that's kind of how I would interpret that. And then, yeah, I would hand over to you if you have any thoughts related to Little Jamaica and this kind of question of thinking about.
Yeah, I'll add to that in a bit on Chinatown from my experience. And I think authenticity in architecture is a challenging thing to talk about. But I think it is, and I think what's challenging about, I'm thinking of the central Chinatown on Spadina and Dundas in Toronto, Eglinton West or Bathurst and Bloor, kind of hubs for the Black community, West Indian community. Again, I was mentioning this before, there's spaces not designed by professional designers or licensed practitioners. So to a degree, they're not in a large part theorized or discussed in situations like this. But I think, China is like, if you look closely at the buildings, is something it's layered. So, that most of that area was a Victorian suburb. And you can kind of see, like, if you look at some of the buildings, there's like a new retail front, but if you look back, you'll see like an old bay and gable peeking up from beyond that. So I think there is something very Canadian, also something very Torontonian about Chinatown and even Little Jamaica. You look at the era when it was built and you see these white bricks. It's kind of built like just pre-war, some of it post-war. And, the West Indian community along Eglinton is completely different in the architecture. If you look close enough, you'll see kind of unique aspects of it. And I've seen that even with, Chinatown in Montreal, not being from the Chinese community, and I see differences. And I think those differences are what makes us Canadian and what makes us kind of unique to Toronto. I even noticed differences between the central Chinatown and East Chinatown where I am. I'm living on Gerrard Street East, and there's like unique differences. And some of that was just when the era when that portion of the city was built. A lot of it was wood frame housing versus kind of brick buildings. Haven't been to China or Hong Kong, so but I can imagine that I think there is, and I think it gets back to your question that I think these conversations are about Canadian architecture, Canadian urbanism. Like I think we're, it's easy to sort of frame it as kind of a group as Chinatown. But I think the Jamaican West Indian community is just as Canadian as any other community. And I think a lot of the things that I find too is it's important is from an architect perspective is you're kind of addressing a lot of similar concerns, but with, a cultural nuance. So there's still issues of, walkability on the street, access for businesses. And I think there's similar issues with Chinatown. I think that's been the power of, the work that Budo's been doing in trying to build a community land trust. They're reaching out to Parkdale, which is a neighborhood in Toronto, in, learning from them. And I think there's a lot that we kind of learned from each community, and for architects to learn from what's the work of non-architects that they're doing. So I think so much of, and I've mentioned this, I think it's maybe the theme of what I've been saying, is so much of what I love about cities are sort of things that happen spontaneously, or things that weren't necessarily planned, or you can necessarily theorize. There's a messiness to them. It's, happened by, people who might not have had a degree in architecture, had a degree in design, or a degree in planning, but they've created something. And I think that's added to the layer and richness of our city. And I think it gets back into beauty. I don't find, particularly Toronto, I think a lot of cities, even in Ontario, North America, beautiful in the traditional sense. And I think the beauty is in all these things that, you're talking about, these added layers of people being there, that kind of make it rich, and I think in turn make it unique and distinct and Canadian.
So that on that note, we're out of time. I think we're even over time. So I thank you all so much for staying with us till the end. And I thank our guests so much for sharing their time and their incredible work and inspiration to this group. I hope something that maybe we can all take away in this room from this evening is to hold a little bit more attention to how power is working and who's holding power in the spaces that we operate, and especially in our disciplines and things that we kind of take for granted, and how, because we all hold some power, and there are also moments where power is not given to us, or we can't access certain things. And so in the power that we do have, thinking about how you can redistribute that power and give power to, or access to, folks who maybe don't have it. How are you going to do that in your practice, in your work, kind of moving forward, with a lot of inspirational ways from both Cheryl and Tura of how we can begin to think about those things and challenge that question. So thank you both so much.